Stanford University.
Thank you. Thank you, SNI, for inviting me, and really pleased to speak with you here today. I'm going to say with no false modesty, I know less about neuroscience than probably everyone else in this room. I spent 20-odd years before working on NeuroChoice doing treatment and health services research on addiction and doing public policy. And to the extent I've learned anything, it's due to my co-conspirators, Rob Malenka and Brian Knutson, who co-lead NeuroChoice with me with the support of SNI. And what this talk is about is essentially me trying to take this area where I still feel like a student, neuroscience, and tie it into the areas that I think I do understand reasonably well, which is addiction and public policy. And that's hence my title, Drug Policy. It's not a no-brainer. Now, when I say drugs in this talk, please don't represent that in your mind only as heroin and cocaine, as are classically illegal drugs. You know, your brain is not a cop. You know, if you're a drug and you find a nice receptor with which you'd like to bind, after securing active consent, of course, no one at the blood-brain barrier is going to stop you to see if you're in the brain illegally, right? So we're going to talk about all drugs today. When I say drugs, I mean nicotine, I mean alcohol, I mean hydrocodone, and of course I mean the traditional drugs we think of as illegal, like cocaine and heroin. So one of the things, if a Martian came down, they would notice about our species is, boy, we sure like drugs. We find them enormously reinforcing, even though they're not nutritive. We don't need them to survive. And yet we do consume them, we do cherish them. I myself cherish, coffee. I cherish the drug caffeine. I had it this morning. I'm having it right now. I don't have a problem with it. It's not as if I had to choose between coffee and my family. I would have difficulty with that decision. I mean, I would miss them. But I'd have coffee, so I think I'd get through. And this has been true of our species for a very long time. You can find, this is Pablo Neruda's Ode to Wine, but this goes back for as long as we have writings. You can see in the Romantic poets and Confessions of an English Opium Eater, people celebrating the virtues of these substances. Chinese poetry going back thousands of years celebrating drunkenness. I also just, it's even imbued with religious meaning. I mean, if you went to a wedding this weekend and you miraculously transformed all the wine into water, I don't think anyone would found a religion named after you. They would probably say, how did this person get an invite, right? But if you, in the Christian tradition, that is the first miracle, turning water into wine. So that is remarkable, the cherishing it. It is also a big driver of commerce. So my friends who do foreign policy, are trying to figure out what does China want. Well, from my parochial perspective, I know one thing they want is they want to smoke and drink a lot more. This is one of the main things that is increasing trade between other countries and China. And psychoactive substances have been an engine of trade for centuries. They were a glue of empires. A huge part of the British imperial trade was bringing in tea and sending out opium. They're even a significant barrier to development in some parts of the world. So this is one of the challenges in countries like Papua New Guinea, to think of one where I know the data pretty well, where it's hard to get parents, particularly fathers, to spend less money on drinking than they spend on their kids' education. And again, a creature from another planet would say, wait a minute, isn't investing in the young till they get to reproductive age part of how they survive? Why does this species care about these substances so much? When you look at opioids prescription, I think an issue everyone is aware of. It's hard to get them, right? You have to go to a prescriber. You may have to have insurance and so on. Nonetheless, when access was even modestly increased, we certainly used these enormously. So these are the number of prescriptions in the United States. You can see how it's gone up. That's more prescriptions than there are adults. So we write enough prescription for opioids each year for every single adult in the country to be on hydrocodone, 5 milligram dose every 4 hours for a month. And the fact that this has gone down slightly is not due to lack of demand. It's due to policy controls. It may be infinite how much we would like to consume these, whether we're consuming them for negative reinforcement, relief of pain, or the euphoria that comes from using them. So we love these things. We cherish, we find them highly reinforcing, yet at the same time, they're highly destructive to us. Now, it's not an accident that these two shaped curves look fairly similar. The first one is how much prescription. The second one is how many people are dying of overdoses. This is now the leading cause of accidental death in the United States, you may know, and that has soared. And I could show you a chart like this for emergency room admissions for prescription opioids, and it would look exactly the same. So we love them, and yet they also do harm to us. The amount of harm collectively that they do is really staggering. So in the developed world, It's 1 in 6 adult deaths are attributable to psychoactive substance use. To give you some other metrics to think about it, if you take all overdoses together, not just prescription drugs, but include alcohol, include cocaine, we're losing, this thing seems to be advancing on its own, we're losing more people to overdose each year than we lost to AIDS in the worst year of the epidemic. Every 6 weeks, addictions in the United States kill more people than died in the Vietnam War. That's how destructive this is. A third of Chinese men smoke. That's going to be, literally hundreds of millions of people dying in the developed world. So that's the twofold nature, and that's what creates this dilemma, and I quote the philosopher Peter Tosh: everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. We cherish these substances, and yet they kill us. And it's a sort of a policy mystery, an ethical mystery, and it's also kind of an evolutionary mystery. How did our species even make it this far when we really, really want to consume these things that are not helpful and can be very destructive? Well, this is where drug policy comes in, is trying to reconcile this dilemma, or try to deal with it as well we can. Now, one of the quick answers is there's nothing to reconcile here. There's plenty of other substances that are loosely controlled. So why can't we just sort this out on our own like we can? Broccoli. And if you're a certain flavor of libertarian and a certain flavor of Chicago school economist, there is no dilemma here. It is people consume these things. It must be because they want to. If bad things happen to them, that's fine. It's no big deal. And I saw an economist quoted on this recently. It was of the school of thought, and I'm using school of thought kind of loosely. But he said, he was asked by a journalist, should the tobacco companies be allowed to sell cocaine? And he said, yes, absolutely. And the journalist said, well, wouldn't more people be addicted? And he said, yes, and that's good, because they want to be addicted, and if they die, then that's their choice, and so it's freedom for them to be addicted. So if you take that point of view, there's really nothing to say about drug policy. You just could sort of have a free market and trust to the wisdom of crowds. Now, I actually do trust the wisdom of crowds on lots and lots of things, but trusting it with this particular issue is a bit like saying if somebody is morbidly obese and has 2 bad knees, what they need to do is run 50 flights of stairs every day. Okay, the body is impaired in precisely the way that they can't take the advice you're giving them. So how do we judge value? How is a free market supposed to work? Where does the wisdom come from? Well, it comes from our brains, and that is precisely the mechanism that is impaired in addiction. Our ability to establish value is distorted. Therefore, in my view, you can't just leave this to the free market to sort out. You have to have policies, including policies that may be kind of paternalistic, to protect people. And this is, there are economists who would disagree with this. Gary Becker, who, although he's no Bob Dylan, did win a Nobel of his own, a rational theory of addiction. But to give you sort of a rebuttal to that paper, our own Doug Bernheim and Antonio Rangel have a nice paper about how economists can model decisions we regret and true mistakes, that not everything we do is a revelation of our real preferences. So now we get into the neuroscience part of the talk and about evolution and our brain. So there's Wallace and Darwin there. How did our species make it? I mean, would you have put your money on hominids if you went back a couple million years ago as the species that would still be, have its descendants still around? Not particularly big, we can't fly, we don't have armor, we're not the strongest, we're not the fastest, yet we are still here because of our brains. And the brains are an amazing system that's signaling and motivating us and telling us things like, you're cold, you get warm, you got warm, that's good. You're hungry, eat, you ate, that was smart. You're a cave guy, she's a cave girl, comb your hair, don't mess it up, this is a chance, and so on, and that sort of thing. And this is incredibly useful, and it's why we survive as a species, that we have the ability to plan, to make learned associations, to make avoidance approach decisions correctly. Now, the system by which we do that, as you all know, this is a NIDA slide I'm sure you've probably all seen, is through a variety of transmitters, one of the critical ones being dopamine. And the snag with all the drugs that addict us is they also work on precisely this same system. In fact, every single drug of abuse causes a massive spike of dopamine. So what that means is the drugs are basically able to corrupt the very system that normally keeps us alive. And you see this in addiction. Like you look at somebody and say, why would somebody who is starving to death spend their last $10 on heroin? That doesn't make any sense. They're basically extinguishing their survival for the substance. But to the person, it feels like, no, this is a basic survival decision for the consumption of heroin, suggesting a corruption of the system that would normally keep us alive. But now it's not. And this is why addiction is such a threat in the modern world. It's sort of, something old, something new. Now, we made it this far as a species, but now we seem to be having a lot of trouble with addiction, which we didn't have so much historically. And that's because what's happening is our brain, which evolved over a long period, is meeting a modern industrial world. This is a cigarette rolling factory in Manila, I believe, about 100 years ago. So I learned from Robert Proctor's book, who was a professor in history and medicine here at Stanford, that if you were rolling cigarettes in a factory in the 1850s, you could roll about 1 per minute. But a modern rolling machine can roll 20,000 per minute. And of course, modern transportation can deliver them all over the world to give you almost ubiquitous species-wide exposure. I took these photos in Iraq and not far from a war zone. It's hard to get water, hard to get food, hard to get a lot of things, but it was not hard to get tobacco. They had both leaf and this was those are fake, by the Russian mob, but nonetheless, people were willing to brave the risk to do that, and people with very little resources were willing to spend their money on them. And it just shows, like, no matter where you go, you can find these substances. That's incredible exposure. Look what's happened very, very recently. So, you know, by recently I mean in evolutionary terms. So you have the hypodermic needle is invented in 1850. It's in wide use by 25 years after that. The first cigarette rolling machine, heroin, amphetamines, cocaine, all synthesized in the late 1800s. Camel made the first blended tobacco cigarette. Hugely important. Up until the 1900s, you didn't get lung cancer from tobacco because it was too hard to inhale. It was too harsh. But they figured out how to make a sweetened blended tobacco. You could inhale deeply, you get lung cancer, and you get addicted. We have the commercial jet age, and then we have the internet. All these things together mean that our species is having a massive exposure we never had before. Now, of course, cannabis was around growing and opium poppies were around growing, but they were localized and they weren't that potent. Now they're everywhere and they're super intense. And this is really new. It doesn't matter when you date the human brain. If you just date it within Homo sapiens, you date it back to when hominids have an expansion in their brain casing, this 150 years is nothing in the ideas of evolution. And so that makes us vulnerable. So drug policy is about understanding the brain in this evolutionary context. Very famous statement by Alan Leshner when he was the head of NIDA, addiction is a brain disease, in the Science paper. But that has gotten, I think, a bit reified and a little decontextualized, far more than Alan would have wanted, almost as if it arrives sui generis in your brain and can only be treated by brain interventions. The truth is, addiction is a disease that becomes prevalent when long-evolved brains meet a newly psychoactive, substance-saturated environment. That's the world we're living in, and the policy question is, what do we do about that? So here's what I take from, so far anyway, from your field. 4 things from neuroscience that teach us about what kind of policies we should have towards addiction. I'm italicizing 2 words for emphasis. Neuroscience, there's plenty of other sciences that have useful things to say, economics, behavioral psychology, and so on. And also, I'm just talking about addiction. There's lots of problems with substance use that don't have to do with addiction. Every weekend on this campus, somebody drinks too much and falls down a flight of stairs, or maybe they have to go to the emergency room because they've had a blackout. Most of those people are not addicted. There's plenty of harm connected to these substances that are not addicted, but I'm just going to focus on addiction. And these are 4 things I think you can draw out of neuroscience that have policy implications. They are: addiction persists beyond acute use and intoxication. The highest vulnerability is in periods of high neuroplasticity. 3, urges are intense, perspective is shortened, time perspective, I mean, and executive function is impaired. And then last, environmental features can trigger brain changes that change people's risk for addiction. I'll go through each one of those. So this is among the most famous graphics in my field. This is work by Nora Volkoff, head of NIDA, who will be visiting us, I'm happy to say, December 1st for a symposium Neurochoice is putting on. But this is showing, these are people who have been addicted to methamphetamine, that long after, 14 months after they have stopped using the drug, their brains are only beginning to approximate the kind of function you see in normal people. Now, this was suspected for centuries. Doctors wrote about this at least as early as the 1800s, that the addiction was a disease, not just a lot of drug and alcohol use, but some kind of change in the body. But it was neuroscience that proved that it was so. What does that matter? That it's not an acute state, it's not just a lot of use? Well, it means a lot of things we do don't actually work. Medical detoxification, which every insurance plan covers, is probably useless. All it does is it cleans out the substances. It may stop the person from dying, but as a treatment from addiction, it would have no value because it does nothing to deal with the enduring neuroadaptation. Likewise, what the criminal justice system often does, we'll lock somebody up, we've caught him with heroin, we'll put him in jail for 30 days, he'll learn his lesson, he'll be deprived of the drug, and so on. Doesn't influence the course at all, again, which is what you expect if these are enduring neuroadaptations and not just a lot of use. And what it also would support what is an observation in the field, which is the interventions that seem to help addicted people the most are enduring interventions and environmental supports. So one of the weird things about my field is two of the best documented effective treatments are methadone maintenance and Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, they have nothing in common on their face. Methadone maintenance is a medically delivered treatment where you give a person an opiate agonist substitute. Alcoholics Anonymous is a spiritually based peer self-help fellowship, but they do have something in common, which is they last a really long time. You can stay in them for years and years and years like you can't other treatments, which again would make sense if what needs to happen is a long-term readjustment of the neural systems for somebody to stop or at least recover from addiction. And this would also tell you that things that are not treatments are probably very important, and all the evidence in our field would suggest that, like having a stable job that provides consistent reinforcers for sobriety and showing up, or having a relationship where that is the case, and so on, that those change people more. And it would also say that public policy matters a lot, like taxation on cigarettes, which raises the behavioral cost of getting cigarettes every single time you purchase them. It becomes an enduring environmental feature. Or a shift in the population where smoking goes from being approved of to disapproved of every single time you smoke. That's going to change the brain over time because it endures over time. Second point is that highest vulnerability when people become addicted would be when brains are the most plastic. Now we know from, again, neuroscience, repeated administration produces changes in receptors and synaptic connections in the brain. Neil Benowitz, I think, might have been the first person to show that smoking increases binding sites of nicotine cholinergic receptors, for example. And then these changes in the brain work synergistically with behavior. The brain adapts, it becomes more reinforcing. I smoke another cigarette, and then I expose my brain to another dose of nicotine. So that type of learning and that type of associational learning and neuroadaptation you would expect would be common when our brains, or most likely to happen when our brains are the most plastic, which is when they are young. It's the same reason advertisers try to instill habits in teenagers, and they don't care what people my age watch on television because we're a lost cause. But if you can sell something to young people, you potentially have a lifetime customer. And that is, in fact, what you see. So here's the epidemiology. When do people develop addiction? And it is overwhelmingly, this is alcohol, but this would be true if I showed you any other, it's when they're young. It's almost always when they're teenagers or very early in their 20s. This has a lot of policy implications. I'll give you one specific one. So the Affordable Care Act, one of the things we worked on in the office was trying to get the Affordable Care Act to fully cover care for people who had substance use disorders. And one of the things in the Act that wasn't specifically about substance use disorders, but matters a lot, and you'll know this if you're a parent, it used to be you could keep your kid on your insurance until they were 18. And the Affordable Care Act says you can do it till they're 26. Now, for most diseases, you would think, who cares? That's when they're young and healthy. You know, hardly anyone gets cancer or heart disease at that age. But from the point of view of addiction, that's a hugely important policy because that's when people, again, they're the most plastic, they're the most vulnerable. So extending that protection of health insurance, they could go to treatment if they needed it, those extra 8 years matters an awful lot. This would also tell you that any kind of policy that limits substance exposure in youth is going to be disproportionately powerful. And then I'll go back to taxation. One of the nice things about cigarette taxes is that they affect the people who are the most price sensitive, who tend to be adolescents, for the simple reason is they have less money in their pocket. An extra couple bucks a week is more off-putting to them than it would be to somebody who has more money in their pocket. It says something about prevention programs that delaying exposure is really valuable. So a lot of the way prevention programs you may have been exposed to in schools or in communities are evaluated is, they look, these kids got them when they were 12, these kids didn't, and the age 18, we measure whether any of them have ever used any drugs, and if it's equal, we say that's a failure. Well, this would tell you, neuroscience would tell you that's wrong, that it's not that it's good that people might have used drugs, but it's when they used them really matters. And even if you push initiation back into a period where the brain is less plastic, you may be lowering risk for addiction. 10 years of substance use when you're 10 to 20 is much riskier for you than when you're 20 to 30, the precise same amount of use. Last, early intervention and treatment access matters enormously for youth. So if there's one point where we really would like to disrupt early problems from turning into addiction, again, it's in adolescence, when the people are most neuroplastic. So we should be investing much more in programs that catch kids, not in a punitive way, but catch them early on and then help them get into some kind of intervention that breaks their exposure. That's much more, it's important to do that in adults, but it's much more important with kids. Okay, so then what is the addicted brain like? While urges are frequent, executive control is impaired and time perspective is shortened. This is basically the kind of stuff that George Koob has, and Floyd Bloom have documented. What happens in the addicted brain is the person starts to experience an anti-reward system where they have a stress response in the absence of the substance, which then gives you negative reinforcement, meaning when I feel bad and I use the substance, and even if it's no longer pleasurable, it takes those bad feelings away. There's impairments in the prefrontal region, and you could just think of this as, there's more go and less stop in the brain. So there's more urges to use and there's less ability to inhibit. And then there's also behavioral discounting, and this is the work from Warren Bickel, who, by the way, is also going to come on December 1st, about how people who are addicted value the future. We all face challenges of we buy a latte when we should have put some money in our retirement. We all discount the future too much. But people who are addicted discount it much, much more. So that's the kind of brain that one is dealing with. And this is sort of an exaggeration of the normal human case of the brain, which I consider is basically a monkey riding a horse trying to explain the decisions made by a lizard. That's the human brain. So you imagine that even more the case. So then you can understand why the common approaches we have don't work. So in the criminal justice system where your parent and it wanted you to take the garbage out, here's what it would say to you. If you don't take the garbage out right now, there's a 40% chance that 6 months from now I will ground you for a decade. The justice system threatens people with serious punishments that may or may happen in the future. Ditto in treatment, when people say, well, if you abstain for 3 months, then we'll know you're motivated, and once I know that, then I'll admit you into rehab. Both of these kinds of models, which are really common, are assuming somebody who has high executive control, low urges, and thinks a lot about the future and not about the present. That is precisely the opposite of the population. That's exactly the opposite of what neuroscience would tell you people need. So what you really want to do is start making interventions that are mapped onto the reality of the addicted brain. And for time's sake, I'm not going to describe how to do that in treatment, but I will tell you a way to do it in criminal justice that I've worked on quite a bit. And this is called 24/7 sobriety. So what do we do with people who drink and drive over and over again? Typically, we threaten them. We maybe take away their license and say, if you kill somebody, you're going to end up in prison for vehicular homicide. None of those things seem to work. So a very inventive prosecutor in South Dakota, with no knowledge of science, neuroscience, or anything, just said, you know what, the problem isn't the driving, it's the drinking. I'm going to sentence people not to be allowed to drink. And so he brought in people who had all these alcohol-related arrests and said, for the next 6 months, you're not allowed to drink. Every single morning, I want you to come into a station and blow into a breathalyzer. If it's negative, you may go about your business. If it's positive, you will be arrested. Not maybe, certainly. Not in the future, right at that moment. And you will be held in a cell overnight, immediately. I'm going to take you straight from the testing station into the cell. Now that is a trivial punishment. Most of these people have been in prison already. They've been in jail for very long periods. Why would a night matter? Well, think about the brain, okay? So they're in a situation where what they care about is what happens right now and what's going to happen for sure, and this system is matched to that. I will immediately get in trouble every single time I drink, right away. And that really changes people's behavior. How much so? Shockingly so. They've done 8 million scheduled tests. The rate at which people show up and blow negative, guess what it is? 99.1%. 99. Now this is a population where we have huge failure. This is in a state where 10% of the people in prison were there for vehicular homicide, generally committed when they were drunk. This has dropped the rate of drink driving arrests and domestic violence arrests and population mortality in South Dakota, and has now spread throughout the country, thankfully, and is in the federal transportation bill. And Rob mentioned at Parliament, I worked with them. We've got a law passed. We're now doing it in London as well. But this is a great example of what you can do when you think about the brain of the person that you're working with, as opposed to operating from kind of folk models of, if I just threaten you enough with a severe enough punishment, off in the future you will change. No, you actually won't. Okay, here's the last the thing I think we can gather, and this is about environmental features that can trigger brain changes. Now for this, I'm going to tell you this is the most speculative part of my talk. I'm going to leap from circuits to policy and across species, but that's what neurochoice does. So that was the goal, very ambitious. So I think one of the most interesting pieces of science I've ever seen is by Morgan and College in Nature Neuroscience. And this is a study of a macaque colony. And here's what they did. They put the macaques in separate housing and gave them access to cocaine, and they scanned them. They observed how much they observed how much they used. Then they opened the doors and let them interact with each other. They immediately form a hierarchy. The ones at the top are kind of mean. The ones at the bottom groom upwards. You know, if you are a postdoc, this may sound familiar. Yeah, try to be nice. And then there's a change in the colony. The ones at the top, when scanned again, have upregulated D2 receptors, and the lower class macaques start using more cocaine. You take them back out of the colony and those effects disappear. This is really pretty amazing stuff. That where you stand in the hierarchy and whether you get a lot of rewards or a lot of punishment affects the likelihood that you would want to use cocaine. Okay, now think about humans. Like I say, I'm leaping species. But this is people, with respect, people in this audience, you probably misunderstand marijuana use in the United States because you think, maybe I smoked some in college or my friend did and now he's a stockbroker. It's not that big a deal. People who graduated college account for only about 1/6 of marijuana consumption in the United States. So about 85% of it is people who did not graduate from college. It is a poor person's drug, that who is consuming it. The typical marijuana consumer, you shouldn't think about a college professor who smokes once in a while. You should think about a gas station attendant with a GED who wakes up in the morning and smokes, and then smokes on his or her break, and then again before he or she goes to sleep. That's where it's concentrated. Now, why is that the case? Well, there's other things like that too. Smoking is a really good example. When people say, we've won the war on smoking, I know I'm talking to a middle class or upper class person. High-income families have cut their smoking dramatically. Low-income families, barely. Some very nice studies from the UK showing that smokers in poor neighborhoods take deeper drags than smokers in middle-class and upper-class neighborhoods, but they report enjoying it much less. Again, at the bottom of the hierarchy, there seems to be more addiction. So here's the nightmare scenario. This is sedating the Morlocks, all right? So this is from the movie, which kind of departed from the book, but I thought the picture was kind of cool. But in the book, essentially you have human society is split into two groups. The Morlocks do all the work. They live underground in kind of dank, dark places. They prepare all the food. They build all the buildings. And the Eloi have lives of leisure up above. But there is a hitch that the Morlocks occasionally eat the Eloi. So how do you sedate the Morlocks if you're the Eloi? Well, here's how you would do it. You would get very unequal societies, which we're increasingly having, and then you would give a series of easy brain hits. You make them available to people on the bottom. Cannabis, alcohol, tobacco, maybe I should add internet pornography and video games in there as well. And that would do a couple things. One, it would extract enormous wealth. The typical cannabis user spends about $2,000 a year, so does the typical smoker. That's going up to the owners. But the Morlocks are just happy enough to not eat the Eloi because they're getting enough reinforcement from these increasingly available chemicals. And to be clear, I'm talking about addiction, not use. The groups of people who abstain entirely from use in our country actually tend to be lower income groups, tend to be religious lower income groups. But I'm saying contingent on use. What is the likelihood that spirals into an addiction? It may be higher for the people on the bottom. You may have seen the New York Times had a really nice piece about men who don't work, and men in their 20s. So like 10% of them don't work. But what do they do all day? They play video games. In these they're marginal jobs, and they said, well, they're fairly satisfied. They're never going to demand a union or anything like that because they're playing Call of Duty. That was this function. So, what's the policy implication? Well, reducing access to psychoactive substances for less powerful groups may be a particularly potent way of reducing addiction. That could be, for example, where do we site our liquor stores and our cigarette stores? Where do we have a minimum unit price for drugs that we sell? Which tend to reduce use disproportionately among people who are lower income. It could also mean that policies and cultural practices that expand access to rewards more broadly may promote the type of brain development that lowers addiction risk. Think of the pleasures you have available to when you leave this room, and not just because you're not listening to me, but the weather, the beauty of Stanford, the interesting people you have to talk to, the activities to engage in, the outstanding athletic facilities, the outstanding entertainment, the cultural treasures and all that. Those are great competing rewards, for drugs. Now imagine you're in a neighborhood where it's not safe to go outside, where it's frightening all the time, where the only enjoyment is the television or the video game. And how likely are you in those two environments to have your substance use spiral into addiction? I think it's entirely plausible, again, I'm jumping speech and all that it's more plausible in the second case that it would, and that would mean we would be doing things, if we wanted to fight addiction, things like to make neighborhoods safer, to make schools better for people who are lower income, to create more opportunities for social engagement. And again, I'll go back to another species. One of the very interesting rat studies to me are the ones that show that, rats do like cocaine and heroin, but they acquire addiction more slowly just if you move them from a singular cage to a place where they can interact. That in itself, that may be true of our species as well. And what that would mean is a big part of drug policy doesn't actually have to do that much with drugs. It has to do with creating a society where rewards are more equitably spread, and then that helps people who don't have them not have their use spiral into addiction with huge consequences for themselves and for their communities as well. Thank you.
Plenty of time for questions. Go ahead.
So Keith, talk to us about the marijuana experiments going on where it has been legalized and what we're about to get ourselves into in California. So given your review here, it's clear that there are probably intelligent ways to do this if you're going to take this plunge, and there are probably some really bad mistakes and bad failure modes. And what are those, and what are we looking at in California here?
Yeah, thanks. So to clarify, so the Blue Ribbon Commission on Marijuana Policy, which I steer with Lieutenant Governor Newsom and then Abdi Sultani, who's the head of the ACLU in Northern California, it's all online, safeandsmartpolicy.org. And the purpose of that was not to say one should or one shouldn't, but more what should you care about in design, because there's massive design decisions involved in this. You can, so for example, in my home state after alcohol prohibition, I'm from West Virginia, we had, alcohol was legal, but only the state could sell it. There was an industry, but you had to go to a state store to buy it. They didn't advertise, they didn't have 2-for-1 sales, they always carded, they weren't open on Sunday. And the places that had that type of legal model had far less public health damage. They had less traffic accidents, they had less alcohol-related violence and so on. Other places went to a full-blown corporate model where you have very low restrictions. People can advertise, which of course puts the cues out there all over. And cue, being sensitive to cues is one of the hallmarks of addiction. That lets people have sales and promotions and make donations to the legislature to loosen up the regulations and so on. So one of the most critical things is this question, is do you make a legalization model that is basically what we have now minus any arrests? Or do you turn it over into a full corporate endeavor like we've had with tobacco, and to some extent with alcohol, I would say. And if that was probably the strongest conclusion of the commission, was that that would be a terrible mistake, to treat this as a gold rush, a corporate gold rush. Unfortunately, some of the initiatives around the country have been kind of corporate gold rushes, in part because that's who funds them. And that's partly why my own preference is that the legislatures get involved in this, because although, whatever you think of legislatures, they're actually harder to really put a totally corrupt and crazy bill through a legislature where there's public hearings and lots of input than it is in an initiative, which, face it, none of us reads anyway. So.
Well, go ahead there, and then you can go after. Go ahead.
Could you comment more on which states have done decriminalization of marijuana socially the best ways, and what they have done?
Okay, so there's two different types of policies, decriminalization and legalization. So decriminalization success would be California. In 2010, California said that if you possessed up to an ounce of marijuana, you would no longer be subject to a criminal violation. Police could take it from you, and they could write you a ticket. But no arrest, no criminal record, no court case. That dropped arrests among both adults and teens by 85% in 12 months for cannabis. There's still some arrests, but there's always going to be some arrests like there are for alcohol. I mean, because we're going to have restrictions. You can't smoke it at school and things like that. But that's decriminalization. Legalization goes beyond that, because decriminalization just focuses on the user. Legalization says now the production and the distribution have become legalized. So it's now legal to basically have big companies. And in terms of how it's very early days, to tell how farly this will evolve and in what way, because it's still illegal federally, and so some of the big money has stayed on the sidelines. But it is striking that there's really been a change among when I go to meetings about cannabis policy, a change of sort of who's driving the train. So if you went to a cannabis reform policy conference 20 years ago, you'd see a lot of people in tie-dye and long hair. Now you mostly see people in suits who have MBAs and actually don't like hippies very much. They think they're bad for the brand. And you see lobbyists. There's a lobbying organization. So my view is that it's the extent to which this will work depends on how well we recognize that public health, there is an opposition between public health and commerce in this domain for the reason I showed you about poverty. From a commerce point of view, addiction is good. There's no customer like an addict. But from a public health point of view, that is not good. And so people like me are always pushing people writing initiatives to put in lots of things to, basically drive public health as opposed to just say this is a free market product, sell where you will, because I think that ends up hurting people at the bottom of the hierarchy.
Thank you. I'm a grandmother, and I'm perfectly aware of an addiction you have not talked about. And this is a pediatric addiction, very young children, to iPhone, iPads. Can you comment on that?
I got a call, excuse me. No. Well, this is one of the great questions of the addiction field, which is what do we do with behavioral addictions, as they're called? And that's one. There's others, gambling, consumption of pornography, things like that, where you're not having a chemical being added to the brain, and yet, when you look at the phenotype, generally what people are doing, it seems extremely similar. And it's a big challenge for people who write like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, like do we call these people have an illness or so on. The thing about one of the things that I think the barrier is not usually met for phones is harm. So, if addiction has to have persistent engagement in consequences with destructive effect, and a huge number of people who check their phones 150 times a day, like I probably do, are not experiencing negative consequences. In fact, they may be experiencing positive consequences. So that's why that has not been, sort of adopted into medicine as an addiction, even though there's some people who, like when I see people walking across a crosswalk on a busy street looking at an iPhone, there clearly is some risk involved.
This gentleman?
Kind of going off of that same point, one of your big points was that public policy should step in where human behavior and the free market can't be trusted to make, an informed decision. And kind of in a bigger sense, there's a lot of things that fall under that sabotaging human behavior, where like misinformation that's designed to be very appealing to our sense, even though it's not true. And, like iPhones and other things. And in some sense, they're not harmful, but isn't this, in a bigger sense, an education issue where we should teach people that they can have their logical senses undermined and there is this way to sabotage yourself?
Well, so this is really a political question, and I told you how I stand on it. I do like markets when markets work, and I don't think they work well for a certain class of products, of which this is one. So I'm entirely comfortable with things that are paternalistic, from nudges to blunt force policies like raising the tax on something that I think people should do less. But it's a hard-fought political issue that people know. So I would say no, whatever people are doing is what they want to do. I mean, what the dialogue is in American life. How much of that is information is a really interesting question. In other words, if you tell people advertising is deceptive, how much that impacts their behavior? Less than we would all like, because we're in the education business. We want to believe in the entirely rational actor. It seems that things that affect the most are things that actually impose a real behavioral cost. So, there's certainly everybody who drinks and drives and been busted 3 or 4 times has already heard lots of lectures about problem drinking, about the risks they're facing, and so on. What they haven't faced is a consistent behavioral cost. Every single time you drink, something bad happens, and that seems to motivate their behavior. So I expect for most people they need more than information, even though information is good.
There's a question over here.
Hi. So you talk about with both people and animals how there's sort of this effect where drugs and addictions to them tend to bridge the gap between the reward our brains demand and what our society is giving us. And to me, that seems like that might make a policy that reduces the supply of one drug lead addicts to gravitate towards another one to get their reward fix that society isn't giving them. Have you observed anything like that?
So yeah, this is a big question, which is just about complements and substitutes. And for example, if marijuana legalization doubles marijuana use and causes alcohol use to drop by 25%, that's a win for public safety and public health, because alcohol is linked to violence and cannabis isn't. Now, we don't know that'll happen. It could be that it doubles both of them, and that would be very bad. We do know there is a general effect, of drug use leading to other drug use. I mean, the thing about the gateway theory, that was, I think, spread rather disingenuously, that if you smoke pot, then you're going to go on to these other things. That was not the way to say it. But what is true is that it does seem once people start using any substance, so a kid who starts drinking or smoking, they're more likely to get to a second substance, which you could think of as could be an access thing. You know different people. Could be a social thing. You fall in with a different group with different norms. But it could also be a neuroscience thing about something in the brain we don't understand about sensitization, making us want to seek a substitute. And that's a really big issue to be solved.
So I have a quick question. You've focused a lot on the consumer versus the seller of these drugs, and it's kind of striking that for all of these things, it's economically favorable to sell them because you make money this way. Is it, I guess, first is a question of ignorance, is whether or not most sellers are actually addicts as well, or are they rational actors, in which case maybe the criminal justice system is or is not tuned to punish them appropriately, or do they tend to be more like addicts, or are they addicts more often, in which case one might think of different strategies for altering their behavior as well?
Okay, so this thing about drug policy, again, go back to all drugs. Clearly, the overwhelming number of sellers are not drug addicted, because the tobacco companies, executives, and all that. So it's something people clearly do out of rationality. It is economically rational. They are highly valued, overvalued, I would say. So you're going to make a lot of money. When you go into the people who are street dealers, you do see, a quarter of them, a third of them sometimes also have a drug problem on their own. Plenty of people get into drug dealing to support their own habit. There's also plenty of people, particularly as you go up the chain, that is not true. It's just an economic decision, kind of sociopathic one, but it is an economic decision, to import, for example, heroin into a poor community.
Okay, one last question, and then we have to end.
You mentioned early on caffeine addiction, and that brings up the example of cases where these sorts of addictions can actually be potentially beneficial to your life, and that's a huge piece of the trade-off that you're talking about. I wonder what you have to say
Caffeine
about that.
dependence, yeah. I mean, so for addiction, remember, you still have to have harm, right? So if there are plenty of things that we use regularly to which we have some dependence, if I don't have it, I get a little grumpy and all that, but I'm not having impairments in my life or social functioning. I'm not repeatedly engaging in a behavior that harms me. What you would need for that, and there are people who do this, would be something like he's got an ulcer, and every time he drinks, it hurts like hell, and it's creating a risk of a severe gastrointestinal problem, and the person keeps using, then they would say that person is caffeine addicted.
Okay, let's thank Keith for a wonderfully entertaining talk.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.